When was the first language spoken? Some people say 100,000 years ago, some say 650,000 years ago, and some say 1.8 million years ago. So why is there so much disagreement? Well, it's down to two main problems. One is there is no direct evidence for language. And to be clear, we're talking about spoken language, not writing. So writing is maybe 5,500 years old at most, but human history is much longer than that. There is rock art from tens of thousands of years ago, and some people think that stencils of hands is an indication of a signed language, though this is controversial. So, not much direct evidence. So what can we do? Well, if we were geneticists, this is what we would do. So if you're trying to identify the age of a trait, you can survey a load of species and see who has the trait and who doesn't. Then you can use DNA to create a genetic tree of how those species are related. Now, we might not know how those genes actually cause the trait that we're interested in, but we can assume that if these three species have the trait, then their most recent common ancestor did too. So we can give an estimate for how long ago this occurred. The problem with language is that we're the only species that has the trait. There's nothing to compare to. That's led some researchers to think that the first language would have been spoken by the ancestor of all modern humans, which is about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. And those dates shift around as we get more archaeological evidence. Some argue the first language spoken back much further, the point where we have a common ancestor with the rest of the hominids. So Neanderthals might have spoken to each other. They had bits of technology, they had basic rituals, they share a lot of our genetics. So why not our ability to speak? This is controversial, but if it's right, then they may have also spoken to our ancestors when they met and interbreeded with us later. And some researchers think that language was spoken even further back than that. And it would have been used over 1.8 million years ago. So what's the reason for these different estimates? Here we come to the second problem, is the problem of definition in linguistics. So what counts as a language? When linguists talk about language, they might mean very different things. For example, they might just mean the ability to convey symbolic meaning, so using words. They might mean taking two words and putting them together to create a second meaning. Well, they might mean the ability to keep doing that over and over recursively to create hierarchical grammatical structures. And that's what Noam Chomsky thinks of when he talks about language. So some of these traits require the evolution of cognitive abilities in the brain, and others require the evolution of manual articulators like the larynx or fine motor control of the hands. And depending on what you're looking at, those traits might take more or less time to evolve. So the disagreement between when the first language was spoken is also partly a disagreement about what's important in language. Let's look at Chomsky's story. He's interested in syntax. There doesn't appear to be any other animal that can do syntax in the way that we do it. So he assumed that the origins of language would have been strictly human, happening about 100,000 years ago, when a single genetic mutation, caused us to be able to take two ideas and put them inside another idea. And he called this ability universal grammar. And this would have evolved initially just to help us think, and eventually became the basis for our language. But it wasn't selected for. Being able to communicate using this, according to Chomsky, didn't give us any selective advantage. We just speak by accident. And that's a very different kind of story from other researchers who are focused on other aspects of language. And those other aspects, we can see some similarity between us and other animals. And so maybe those abilities are older and they form the basis of other parts of language. So there's a continuum in the field between people who think that language is a single special thing that evolved very recently, to those who think that it's based on a series of different abilities and skills, some of which we might share with animals, and might have taken a longer time to evolve and come together. If you think language evolved gradually, then the idea of the first language might not make any sense. Instead, some people think of language as a kind of advanced technology right at the beginning, something that would have been used in hunting or in rituals, but not necessarily used by everyone. Different groups may have invented different bits of language, and then those bits would have come together as the groups met and communicated with each other. And then, over thousands of years, those languages would have adapted to our brains to become more learnable, perhaps more learnable by children. So the question might not be when did we first evolve to speak language, but when did language first evolve to be spoken by us?